Carrie Mae Weems' Sea Island series was made over a quarter of a century ago. This body of work, rather early in her career, is a sensitive and intimate look at people and place, but is not straightforward documentary. She approaches history and culture with her individual artistic sensibilities. With that in mind, it has been an honor to learn about the history of our region over the past year or so, importantly through her artist eyes to help filter this information. Weems' Sea Island series mixes the historical significance of the Gullah people with the engagement of cultural memory. And in doing so, she is connecting the long lineage of West African roots, slavery, and emancipation of the Gullah people on these sea islands with the celebration of the vibrancy of culture that they have brought not only to the South, but to the history of America. But Weems asks us to actively participate in the idea that these are our memories as well, a cultural memory that is vital to contemporary American society today. Please join me in welcoming Carrie Mae Weems to Telfair Museum.
Thank you so much. My goodness. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you for coming. It sounds so impressive. It's like, I want to meet her. You know, I always just simply think of myself as just a hard-working girl. And while it's always a pleasure to be honored and to have the work realized and engaged, I feel simply blessed that I'm allowed to do the work. And that in some small way, I feel as though I'm a vehicle for the possibilities. And that somehow or another, I've been given voice. Reese, Courtney, thank you so much for the honor of inviting me here to the Telfair Museum to present. How many artists are in the room tonight? A lot of artists are in the room. May I ask all of the Gullah Geechee people to stand so that we can acknowledge you and see you? Do you mind standing, please? Bravo. Thank you. Thank you. So, what I thought I would do is sort of take you through the kind of work that I make and how I make my work and the kinds of questions and concerns, ideas that really sort of bubble up, come through the work. All kinds of artists have influenced me. I read Toni Morrison on my knees. I mean, there were passages so absolutely extraordinary that all I could do was walk around the room and say, right. Right? You know, that sort of way that somebody reaches out from a page, from across a landscape, a distance, and they touch you profoundly, right? Then they utter in such a way that you think, yes, I've always thought that way, I've always felt that way, but I never knew how to articulate it. That is, I think, what art has constantly done for me. It has been a healing place to go, a profound place to live in. I can remember reading Tolstoy for the first time, his great Anna Karenina. And one of the reasons that I think about Tony and Tolstoy in the same breath is because I think that they write out of the same deep, complicated well. And I remember sitting in a room, young graduate student or undergraduate at CalArts, sitting in my tiny little room in Newhall, California, reading this section of Anna Karenina, and then about 15 minutes later, when I had finished the passage, and I realized that I wasn't the horse, and I wasn't a teacup, and I wasn't the wind, right? And I wasn't a spur, and I wasn't a hat, but actually I was a woman sitting in a room in Newhall, California. All I could do was put the book down and clap. I applauded to myself for about 5 minutes. Like that is the extraordinary power of art, to really reach out and to engage us and to allow us to be many, 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 many things, and to embrace the complexities of who we are. And so spending time with other artists, understanding other artists, engaging other artists, feeling what other artists are doing, again, whether they are singers or dancers or choreographers, writers, poets, matters to me. And I start a lot of my days in that way. People like Frank Sinatra and Nina Simone are two songwriters that I listen to a lot. One of the reasons that I also listen to and think about and engage, not only am I sort of interested in these sort of ideas of how art functions and what it does for us, but I'm also interested in sort of the influence. What are the influences? Right? All of us in one way or another are influenced by somebody, right? All of us in one way or another are always engaged in the act of appropriation, in the act of taking on, right? Borrowing from, and building our own archive as we build our own selves, right? None of us come into the world wholly formed, right? We come with our stuff, right? And then slowly but surely we add on to who we are, and we express then the dimensions of who we are and what's possible. And so spending time and thinking about these ideas about influence and about impact and about power and about appropriation is something that I'm deeply engaged in, and all of that comes to bear in one way or another, I think, in the work that I make. Pieces like, this, like by Felix Gonzalez Torres, these beaded curtains, red beads, white beads positioned next to one another, thinking about what was happening to his body as he was experiencing AIDS, right? A sort of shift that was happening in his very cellular structure from white to red blood cells, right? And the balance or the imbalance of that as he was facing his death. This amazing sort of poetry and poetic of amazing expression, asking the audience to constantly pass back and forth through those beads. Or Anna Mendieta, these sort of amazing pieces. This way in which I think the artist has used body has been something that has been a part of me. Anna always tiptoeing on eggshells or using her body splayed out in the open, right? Touching it, feeling it, painting it, distorting it, messing with it. And the same with somebody like Adrian Piper. And so all of these artists I keep coming back to, and again, the sort of idea, not only about the ways in which, I think about influence, but the way in which other artists think about influence as well. This wonderful piece by somebody like Lorna Simpson, moving us across the ways in which Duchamp himself worked, or these sort of wonderful Manet's work that we've come back to again and again and again and again and again, and this kind of reinterpretation contemporarily by people like Micheline Thomas. But hundreds of artists have used this image to come back to again and again and again, this odalisque image, this reclining nude, and the way in which that reclining nude functions, the way the body functions historically in painting. How to disrupt that, how to embrace that, how to think about that, how to think about the body, how to think about this great, great painting, Origins of the World. I didn't know, for instance, that Duchamp had actually used Origins of the World in his interpretation of the body much later, right? But talking about the desecration of the body. And so the ways in which I think artists are always influencing one another, thinking about what this skin is, what it does, how it speaks about who we are, and about language, and about culture, and about ideas, and about appropriation. And of course, as we sort of, contend with, the Me Too movement at this moment, this idea about the female body, right? The weight of the female body and what it's been asked to bear. We're living through extraordinary times. A lot of the work that I've made over the years, I love making photographs, and I make a lot of them. And I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. I'm deeply interested in history. I'm deeply interested in culture. I'm deeply interested and curious about how things work. So I'm not a historian, but I'm interested in history, and I'm always bringing these ideas to the work, and I'm always returning to similar themes and questions in the work. It's ideas about the relationship of family, the relationship of woman to man, of women to their children, right? Always employing, always digging, asking these kinds of questions about the relationships and questioning the relationships and how those relationships are formed, thought of, and managed. Kitchen Table was a very important piece. In Kitchen Table, this series consists of many, many photographs and text, has been shown all over, whether it's been in South America or in Europe, United States, and Japan. No matter where it's shown, women relate to it, men relate to it. These sort of questions about the role of monogamy, the role of power, the role of patriarchy, the role of a friendship. All of those things are really sort of layered in the work. And so using image and text is something that I've done for a really long time. And and not because I'm not a very good writer, but I use text because I'm really interested in trying to underscore something else about what I'm thinking, what I'm seeing, and complicating the problem, maybe problematizing the question and the issues that are involved in these sort of dynamic relationships. One of the things that I've learned a great deal about through the practice, through the work, is that the work always tells me what it needs to be and where it wants to go. And that a part of my responsibility of the artist is to simply get out of the way of the work so that the work can do the work that it needs to do, right? So, and as artists, for you artists that are in the room, this idea that you are always building towards your own archive is absolutely crucial, right? And that one work follows the next. And that it really begins to tell you who you are, what you want, what you don't want, what you desire, and what you're made of in very interesting ways. This piece, another image and text piece that came after working on Kitchen Table, another image text piece. Standing on shaky ground, I posed myself for critical study, but was no longer certain of the questions to be asked. It was clear I was not Manet's type. Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me. These are all my favorite painters. But it could have been worse. Imagine my fate had de Kooning gotten hold of me. And so, so I started thinking about sort of my relationship to painting, to painters, and to the history of painting, the history of the body, this dark body, in relationship to the ways in which it's been negotiated in painting, right? Or not. I was in Rome, and one of the greatest tragedies was that as much as I love Fellini, he just didn't love me back. He just never made anything, with anything that looked like me. And then I thought, well, maybe I have to do that. This piece, framed by modernism, was the precursor to the piece that I just showed. This is a piece with Robert Colescott. Robert Colescott represented the United States for the Venice Biennale in 1997, maybe, something like that. Maybe 1998. I'm really bad with dates. And so, it's like, again, sort of, he helped me, working with him really helped me to understand, begin to sort of think about my relationship to painting and to painters. Seduced by one another, yet bound by certain social conventions. You framed me and I framed you, but we were both framed by something larger. We were both framed by modernism. And even though we knew better, we continued that time-honored tradition of the artist and his model. This idea, I think I'm always sort of interested in how am I implicated in my own victimization? To what extent am I culpable in it? To what extent do I bring things onto myself? To what extent do I stand forward? To what extent do I resist? Or to what extent do I acquiesce, right? And so these ideas, these sort of tensions about being aware of the way in which I participate in my own victimization becomes really important to me, because then I can work through that, right? Then I can work through that. Then it means that I have some level of choice. Notions about appropriation continue, and they push and they pull through much of the work. And I've been very, very lucky, because I've been commissioned to do a lot of work that I would have done anyway. So it's really perfect. This piece was a very important piece as well. The materials came, the J. Paul Getty Museum asked me to respond to a series of daguerreotypes that had been collected by a really fascinating man named Jackie Wilson. This was 1995, 1996. I'm the first living artist, actually, that the J. Paul Getty ever worked with. And it brought up all these very interesting questions that we might be able to talk about a little later. So in appropriating this material, these Agassiz photographs that were made in South Carolina, became important for me to really sort of think about this idea, again, about the body, how the body had been described, how the body had been articulated, how it had been maligned, how it had been degraded in relationship to what Agassiz, the photographer, and the anthropologist was attempting to explore. It's a long piece. It consists, it's called From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. It consists of maybe 35 photographs, but I'm only showing you a few. And the text is layered, and I change the color, I manipulate them some, and I add my text. You became a scientific profile, a Negroid type, an anthropological debate, and a photographic subject. And the thing that I was really interested in, as I often am in the work, is how do you talk about both the history of the ways in which people, African Americans in this particular case, have been subject in American photography, and how do you also talk about American history simultaneously, right? So that I'm always sort of pushing and pulling towards these sort of two broader ideas, trying to fuse a third way, another way of speaking out about the ways in which the body has been subjugated. It was a very important project to work on. Amazing things happened around this project. I mean, for instance, Harvard threatened to sue me for using the photographs that I actually just showed you. I did them in 1995. I thought it would be perfect if Harvard actually sued me, because it was a moment that we really sort of needed to talk about these complicated questions of ownership, right? Who owns what, right? And what were they attempting to do with it, and then how did I use it? So I knew that, for instance, legally, it could be a problem. Legally, I might be in trouble. But I thought that for some reason, I thought I could stand sort of on the moral high ground. So I called them and I said that they should sue me. That I thought that would be actually a very, very good idea. And then they decided not to sue me, but then they bought the photographs. So then I was deeply confused. These ideas about color are always sort of, informing the work. And I play with ideas around color too, right? Color, right? This binary of white and black is fairly uninteresting. And in my neighborhood, people were high yellow and golden brown and cherry red, and right. There are all these other beautiful ways in which one could describe what somebody looked like, right? They were never black, right? They were never black. They were something else. They were more refined, defined, and purposeful. And so I've used color constantly in this way, and I keep coming back to this again and again and again. Just as I've appropriated other people's work, I also appropriate my own, right? That it always infuses me, that it's teaching me, that it's guiding me, that's telling me another way that I can possibly work through ideas about subjectivity, about objectivity, right? And standing back to look at the breadth and the range of what happens when we live behind color, we function behind color, we're hidden sometimes by color as well, right? It's a very deep way in which I'm often trying to negotiate it and question it, and then I also just like color, right? There's this really wonderful saying that, within seriousness, there's very little room for play. But within play, there's tremendous room for seriousness. And so this idea of coming back again and again to ideas where we talk about this sort of level of play so that you can get to something profound and deep about yourself is quintessential to the way in which I think about working. When I came to South Carolina, I've been to Savannah many times, and I met Madam Joan here, who's here in the audience with us, and Suzanne Jackson, the great painter, lives here now. I've come here many times, and when I was growing up, my father, who was really a great storyteller, used to tell me these stories about these Geechee people. These Geechee people. And they, it's like, Dad, right? What do you mean? Right? My father's from Mississippi, from Arkansas, actually. And he would tell me about these people, and I didn't quite believe him. I didn't believe him. I just couldn't. These people who lived, someplace this part of the South, and they spoke in a sort of patois that it sounded like they were a different language, and it was like, no, this is not possible. And then studying folklore and meeting myself coming down the street one day. I met myself coming down the street after discovering the great folklorist Zora Neale Hurston. And I think I was telling somebody about this earlier today, maybe. And I was in this, this sort of deep crossroads in my life, and I was really afraid. And I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to do as an artist. I didn't know what the work was going to be like or look like. I didn't know if I was going to be successful, if I was going to fail. I just didn't know anything. And I was just about 29 years old. And I went to visit a friend, a very, very close friend, over a weekend. And I just wanted to, I was living in San Diego, and I decided, on the way back home, that I wanted to take a bus because I just didn't want to get home too quickly. I just wanted to just be away as long as I possibly could, because I knew somehow in my heart that when I got home, I had to face me again and what I didn't know about what I was, what kind of woman I was, and what kind of artist I wanted to be, and all of that. On the way out the door of my friend's house was a book, Their Eyes Are Watching God. It was sitting on a table. And earlier, a few years earlier, someone had told me that I reminded them of this woman, Zora Neale Hurston, who I didn't know. And I looked down and I saw this book, and it was written by this woman, this great Zora Neale Hurston, and I picked up the book and I asked if I could take it with me. And I got on the bus going back to San Diego from San Francisco. And I opened up this book, and from the first paragraph, the very first paragraph, I was hooked. And what I learned from her and through her, that influence that we were talking about earlier, was absolutely extraordinary. And 9 hours later, or whatever, 10 hours later, when I stumbled off the bus in San Diego, I read the book like this. I had my suitcase behind me, and I got off the bus and I was reading it, and I, walked up the flight of my stairs into my apartment. I was still reading it, and I unlocked my door and I walked in, right, and I was reading it, and I sat down in my bed and I was reading, right? I mean, like just this amazing voice, and it was the kind of voice that told me that I could be, and that there was something in me, there was something about my story, there was something about where I came from, there was something about the everyday, there was something about who we are as simply a fine people that just rang. Right? And that I could use all of what I was and all of what I knew as the wellspring from which to drink from. That I didn't have to look around the world, that I could just look at what I knew, right? What I knew, what my family knew, what my family believed, right? What people around me believed in the everyday. That I could simply look at that, right? And that I could make something out of that. And so I came here at a certain point. I decided that I was going to study folklore, and then I came here at some point, in the early 90s, to begin thinking about looking at these people that my father had told me stories about for years. And I found myself in Savannah, and then I found myself over in the Carolinas, and I went over to Sapelo, and I posed as a maid at that time to get onto the island of Defusky, right? Because people were trying to take Defusky from these few remaining families that were living there. Trying to understand the sort of beauty, or the beautiful articulation of a culture that had simply laid itself out in the most beautiful and the most poetic way. I mean, this is one of my favorite photographs. This box spring in a tree, I think, is absolutely fabulous, right? Well, what does it mean to leave a hat on a bed? And what does it mean to leave shoes on a bed? And what does it mean to have hubcaps in your yard? What does it mean to paint those windows blue? And what does it mean to wallpaper your walls? Right? And it doesn't just mean that in Gullah culture, it means that in many, many cultures. You can look around the world and see cultures and belief systems reflected everywhere. And so I really wanted to think about that in general and then specifically. So that we can talk about, for instance, this slide actually needs to be adjusted. If you can adjust things from up there, right? These ideas about Igbo landing, what Igbo landing was. Right? And the sort of ongoing threat to these cultures, to this culture, to this very particular thing, and to this kind of way of life. And fortunately, we're hearing more and more and more and more and more, and that this sort of work that people are doing is beginning to sort of elevate and this sort of shared understanding of what this culture is, what Gullah Geechee culture is, what Africa is in relationship to America, etc. Boneyards and belief systems, and how do you deal with the dead? How do you deal with the dead, and how do you deal with the living? How do you deal with the newborn, right? What do you do when somebody is newborn, right? How do you shepherd them into the world? This relationship between, these ideas about, Gullah and Angola and Gullah and Geechee, right? These are like double sounds. They're echoes, and there's an echo on the other side of the water that tells us that this doesn't simply didn't spring from nowhere, but this is a long, deep, and fascinating lineage from one culture being transported to a next, and then the way in which it gets articulated in the new world. The Signifying Monkey, of course, is a text that has been around for since maybe just the 20s or the 30s, right after the Titanic, I think. And once I came, I remember coming home. I worked in the Sea Islands for maybe about three years, off and on, coming back and forth when time or money could allow it, because I did all of this on my own. It was just out of my own sort of curiosity and my interest to get to know a place and to understand my relationship to a place, and my understanding about culture, and my understanding about how art could be infused in that culture, and how the culture could infuse the work. I came home from being in the Sea Islands exhausted, I remember stumbling into my house at about 5:30, 6 o'clock one evening, coming home from Charleston. I was living in Oakland, California, and I thought, oh, wow, I'm so glad to be home. But I guess now I have to go to Africa. So I immediately thought, well, now I have to go actually, to the motherland. And so I got on the phone and started making plans to visit a number of countries in West Africa, and again thinking very much along the same kinds of lines. One of the things that really interests me is how one shapes a world, how I shape a world, how you shape a world, how cultures shape a world. This installation is just called the Africa Series. This was an installation that took place at the Museum of Modern Art, of looking at sculpture and looking at architecture and the role of architecture and the way in which architecture defines a place, how sculpture defines and articulates a people. I often use multiple panels and text in work. I've never liked things really that are on straight lines. And so, this idea of, I'm also really sort of interested like in sort of the physicality, like where you have to be as the audience, or even myself, what is my relationship to the work? And how does the work either pull me toward it or ask me to step back away from it to view it, right? So there's always this kind of dynamic physical relationship that I'm hoping one has with the way that the materials, the text, and the photographs are used. So to read the text, you have to step in, but to see the images, you have to step back. And so it's a physical relationship. From Timbuktu, when I was a kid, people used to say, I'm gonna kick your butt to Timbuktu. I thought, Timbuktu? Right? I thought that was also an imaginary place, right? And then, of course, I found out that was a real place and that I could go there. So I did. And what I found on my way, or trying to get to Timbuktu, were these sort of extraordinary, the sort of way that architecture really laid bare for us what something was, what something meant. In the United States, we sort of deal with who belongs to a place, right? I have a great friend, James Robinson, another folklorist, who did a really beautiful piece called The Folk Signs of Folklore, right? When you see like the House of Style, who goes there. Do you know what I mean? The House of Elegance. I mean, how a sign is painted. You know who it belongs to. When you see a building like this, or a facade at Yale University, you know who it belongs to, and it tells you either you belong in it or that you don't. You're excluded from it. The architecture is layered to tell you. More recently, architecture has become glass, right? It's all transparent, which is also, I think, very interesting. These buildings are like, oh, right? We know who belongs to these spaces, right? We know what they mean, and it's simply encoded on the architecture. And that idea sort of skimming, right? Sort of producing the skin and having the building function as a skin and as a gender, I think is absolutely extraordinary. The gender of architecture goes on and on and on and on. And I think a few people have been studying it actually in the last few years. And so I went there, to Africa. I wanted to look at sort of that sort of deep structure of architecture, right? Sort of the architectures of sexuality, the architectures of a kind of material culture that told me something about the ways in which people designed a life, designed a world for themselves. But I was also interested in the ways in which the architecture of power and the architecture of slavery also presented itself. And so I went to sort of like the great encampments of slavery up and down the West Coast, right? Just to look at them, to know them, spending a lot of time in them, photographing them from every conceivable angle. always with that sort of door of no return at the end, right? Always sort of suggesting that. It was very, very important work. And again, I haven't spoken about these works really in a long time, so it's really nice to kind of be here talking about them. But these ideas about architecture have kind of pulled me around the world. Now, I was given the Rome Prize, which was really fabulous. It was really great, And like I could just go work in this great city. And I had thought about going when I was 16. I remember seeing Gidget Goes to Rome, and I thought, that's going to be me. I'm going to be on the back of some boy's Vespa. Some cute little Italian boy whizzing me around, eating pasta and ice cream like Audrey Hepburn. I had this whole fantasy, going. But I didn't go to Rome. I traveled all over the place, and then I didn't go to Rome until I was actually maybe in my 50s, I think. And I think I'm really glad that I went later, because otherwise I simply would have slept my way across Italy. And when I got there, by then I think I kind of knew things. I sort of knew myself well enough. I knew that I was really deeply interested in architecture. And again, going back to this idea, the work, whether you're writers or musicians, the work really tells you what it is and what it needs to be. And again, you have to get out of the way of it so that it can speak to you. So I knew that I was really interested in shooting a film there, which I did do in Fellini's studio, because I needed to think about Fellini up close and personally, and then to look at the power of architecture. Again, in another very particular kind of way, and this time sort of using myself and my body as a kind of witness and kind of a guide that would move me through this extraordinary city. The only pyramid, actually, outside of Africa and Central America, actually is in Rome. Moving through these ideas about the role of the role of architecture in the arm of the state was an important idea. A lot of people had spoken about, had looked at ancient Rome, which I, of course, did too, and I think ancient Rome is essential and important. But I also wanted to look at fascist Rome and Mussolini's Rome, to sort of bear witness to what this fascist power had actually meant. And so I spent a lot of time, I photographed, I made many photographs. I think the entire body of work consists of about 50 photographs, and I've only shared them and shown them a few times. And this idea, again, of sort of using my body as a site, is something to land on, but always project it towards something else that I'm really interested in the audience experiencing along with me, has become a method and a way of working, and I've been doing this now for a number of years, really interested in this notion of performance, of being the observer, and along with that, as being the observed. And just as I was finishing this year-long adventure in Rome and photographing, it was really quite wonderful. This is the last photograph I took of the National Museum there. And it occurred to me that, that was another something that I really needed to investigate, the role also of museums and the power of museums and who is in and outside of museums, right? And how the museum functions as a site and as a space, right? Who's in them and who's outside of them, and what do they do? And so I again, coming home from the Carolinas to Oakland, I just thought, okay, well, I'm going to go home. I'm going to throw some underwear in a bag and get my toothbrush and make some plans and just fly around Europe. So I spent, just time just flying around Europe for 3 weeks, just photographing every single museum I could. And again, I have this sort of extraordinary body of work that came out of it, and it was absolutely wonderful to do. Then I came back and I looked at the monuments in the United States, and photographing those monuments, for instance, in in Washington, D.C., the Lincoln Monument, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Monument, and so forth. Ideas about voice and language. We've entered like this amazing time in the United States, and one of the things that became like really, really clear to me at a certain point in my making, in my building, in my considering the who and what of ourselves as a nation, it occurred to me that the United States, and that we had come to this moment, because of all of the assassinations that happened in the country. You think about like Brazil or Venezuela, right? These sort of third world countries where assassinations happen and governments shift and change, but we rarely apply the same understanding to our place. So we had the assassination of Martin, and the assassination of Medgar Evers, the assassination of Malcolm, right? The assassination of Robert and John Kennedy in this country, right? In this country, in this democracy, right? And that a part of the way in which we've arrived, I think, at this incredible historic moment in which we happen to be involved in is through these heinous crimes that have sort of forced us to sort of deal with a kind of reckoning with who we are. And now we are at another site of reckoning, right? That we are this sort of country that is in flux, and we are a democracy that is in flux, and we are trying to understand and participate and reshape what that democracy is going to be. And who wins that battle? Right? I mean, that's the tug of war that we're in right now, right? Who's going to win this battle around what democracy means, what it looks like, and what we want it to be, right? So at this sort of crucial moment where we have this sort of amazing energy towards progress, we also have this equal force that is attempting to pull us back, right, to hold on to traditions that are shifting and changing and breaking in profound ways. So I do that kind of work. And the piece from this work, there's also a video that's attached to it. It's called Constructing History. So there's a video projection and a whole group of photographs that go along with sort of looking at this sort of deep structure of how we wind up and how we are as we are. I also look at pop culture. And in the last year or so, I've gone to many film sets, TV sets, like Scandal, Empire, How to Get Away with Murder, right? These sort of new sites where these sort of new things are happening on the horizon. Where Shonda Rhimes is doing what she's doing, and, Daniels is doing what he's doing. There's all the sort of new stuff that's going on in the world around popular culture, shifting and changing, and I thought that I really needed to spend time in that way. So it's, of course, it's an image and text piece, and these are actually fairly large. Again, sites like Empire, and it's been really wonderful working in this way and being on these sets and sort of thinking about what they are, and thinking and knowing that, some of us have sort of come along late, right? We've come along late. And so we can't participate in the same way that some of the younger people are going to participate in this field, but there is this sort of new energy, right? And there are now 100,000 TV stations. And everybody needs context and content, right? And so people are vying in a way that they've never had to vie before. And it allows for new voices to emerge, right? And so all of these young people that are working, people of color are working in a way in the industry and in the field that they've never worked before. Long way to go, yet and still, but they're working. New films and new ideas are emerging and coming to the fore, and I thought that it might be really important to spend some time just looking at those things. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been a busy girl. And so, not only do I do my own sort of independent work, but I also have a small nonprofit where I work with kids, training them in the arts, doing things in the arts. I do billboard projects or newspaper projects. I train my kids. I train them in photography and video and design. Thinking about this idea of how are we responsible for our own communities. Really paying a lot of attention to that. We send them into sound studios. I have a relationship with sound studios. Many of them think that they're going to be rappers, but most of them will not be. You will not be rapper. You will not be Jay-Z, right? But you can certainly be, a sound designer. You can certainly be a graphic designer. You can certainly be a videographer. Right? I mean, they're all, so that, I would throw out, like an album, or a CD and say, okay, how many jobs are associated with this one CD, this one item, this one thing, right? And so I've been working with these kids, and they're great, even when I don't like kids. More recent work. I've been thinking a lot about, of course, what's gone on with our young men, the killings that have gone on, the trauma that this has caused all of us, the pain of it, and wanting to pay homage to these young men and women who've lost their lives unnecessarily in the process of just living. Right, because of the ways in which this body has been thought of, the ways in which this body has been theorized, the way it's been subjugated, the way that stereotypes have been imposed on it. And so I got a call from somebody who asked me if I would be interested in doing a project, another commission for the Spoleto Festival. And so I started working. I was working with these ideas and working around this sort of idea of grace. And so I thought, right. And then the Emmanuel Nine were killed, right? All these young boys, and then this congregation welcomes into their midst a murderer who decides to take their lives. And I thought, I have to say something about this. I have to make a work about this. And so I, working with musicians and singers and dancers and poets, and brought together a group of people to look at this thing. And I kept asking myself, well, what is grace? Grace notes. What is grace? What does grace mean? What's the meaning of grace? And so I had many conversations with, I'm making the work, I'm dealing with the work, I've, even presented the work, but I still hadn't come yet to a clarity in my own soul. What is grace? I called a bunch of friends, called my pastor, had friends, called other friends. I have all these people talking about grace. Oh, that's God's unmerited favor. I thought, that's not enough for me. No. It's something else. It's something else that I'm trying to get at here. And I was crying and I was upset because I cry a lot, upset a lot. And I'm asking myself these questions. And then finally I called my mother. I said, Mama, what is grace? And I had one of those conversations with my mother that you only have maybe once or twice in a lifetime. It's like love. You only have love once or twice with somebody in a lifetime. And we talked, and she talked about grace. She talked about love and compassion and unconditional love. Unconditional love, and that ability to really be open to others, no matter who they were, no matter what they were trying to do. That somehow in the midst of the storm, you had the ability to still hold on to the depths of your humanity, to the depths of your generosity, and to offer that gift always to others. I just thought that was fabulous, right? That in the midst of the storm, you still held on to the core of your generosity, to the core of your spirit, that you did not give up on yourself, to the core of your humanity, and you offered that to somebody else. And so I thought that I would just share with you just sort of one last piece, if you don't mind. Alrighty. And so I'm just going to read just a little bit of this piece that I put together. And it's a video piece that comes out of Grace Notes. It's a video projection that plays. Okay. A woman stands in the thaw of winter, the beginning of spring, reflecting, considering, imagining, contemplating the past and imagining the future. With one step, she could be in the future in an instant or in the past in the moment, the now. But to get to now, to this moment, she needs to look back over the landscape of memory. Lost in memory, the woman faces history, a history with a story that's been told 1,000 times before. If you look on the horizon, here and there, first seen, now hidden, are little sightings of hopes, of dreams, of memories. If you look closely through the corridors of time, even within the horror, one could see the fluttering wings of doves, wings like time, batting out beats of hope. Hope was the thing missed, the thing hoped for. You could almost taste it, but it was just out of reach. And as I sort of, thought about this idea about history and sort of struggling with myself to in some way answer this complex question for myself of what is grace, which is something that I will ask you, this audience, what is it? What does it mean to you? I went to bed. It was in last August, and I had this extraordinary dream. I had this dream that this massive tsunami was coming. This massive wall of water was coming, and it was going to destroy us all. And I started running because I wanted to save myself, and I wanted to alert my friends that something horrible was coming down on us, and we had to get away from this thing. And so I'm running, and I turn to my right, and I see Trump. In my dream. And I ran further, past him. And then I saw a group of my friends climbing a great ladder. And they were singing, "We're climbing Jacob's ladder," right? And not as a hymn, but as a protest song, right? I think that saying, what did Michelle Obama say? When they go low, we go high, right? And it was just, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. And just this power. And it shook me out of my sleep, right? Shook me out of my seat, had me running out onto my back porch and saying, "Thank you. We can do this. We can survive this tsunami. We can survive it. We can live. We can live." Thank you. Are there any comments or questions? It's a lot. There's a lot there. And if not, I completely understand. Yes, sir.
How do you select your models? What's your thinking behind your models that you use for your artists?
Oh, usually they're just my friends. Like I don't put out casting calls or anything like that. I'm usually using people that are around me, my friends, myself, my own body, and or students. Sometimes students participate with me as well. Constructing History was actually made at SCAD. was made at SCAD, and these are all my students. The thing that was really kind of wonderful about working with these young people at SCAD in particular was that they had come from across the campus, but by the time they finished working on the project, because we worked on it maybe for a semester together, a number of them had decided to change their majors. People that had been doing, maybe sculpture decided to do performance. People that were doing performance decided to do, writing. I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, it had a very interesting impact on the way they began to think about their practice, which is, I think, a really wonderful thing. And yes, there's a question here and a question there.
Have you ever
Oh, yes, you standing up.
Have you ever been afraid to do a piece?
I'm sorry?
Have you ever been afraid to do a piece?
To do a piece? No. No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I've been afraid to open a piece. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I knew, for instance, I made a body of work not long ago, and I knew that it was like, Carrie, this is not right. The scale is not right. Like, the proportions are not right. Like, so it's more like that. Where I'm just no, you have to know when you fail. You have to know when you don't deliver on your own promise. As an artist, you have to know that. So I've made many, many mistakes, and but as they say, really freedom is the appreciation of taking risk. Just the ability to take risk and letting the chips fall where they may. I mean, my sense is that if you produce something that has no lasting impact, then people won't remember it. All righty. A question here? Yes, ma'am.
As a woman of color, how often do you run into people who don't think that you're credible? And how do you do it?
Credible?
How sometimes people are like, oh, you're just a woman, or as a person of color, how often do you run into issues trying to get your work out there?
Well, this is a very interesting question. This is a very interesting and a very complex question. I was just commending the Telfair for having female technicians in the back. I go to many, 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 many places where women are not in charge, and men are often in charge of just about everything that's kind of going on. And so for a long time, because I've always thought of myself as being very, very cool. You know what I mean? Right. Very, enjoyable to be around. And so, when things don't happen, I think, oh, well. And then I realize, oh, this is not happening because I'm a woman. And this is not happening because I'm a woman of color also. I mean, it's sort of what's happening if, because I'm black, and what's happening because I'm, not, or I'm a woman. It's just I just don't know. So my sense is that you just keep doing your work. That there are all of these forces that are out there that you have absolutely no control over, right? You have no control over. What you can control is you. That's pretty much the only thing that you can control to a certain extent, right? It's simply you. And working with that knowledge and doing the best that you can do with the work. I'm not really worrying so much about that. We know that we're pushing. We're pushing against the grain. We're pushing against traditions, and that will simply go on, right? That will simply be going on. But I think that the more important thing is to really invest in the complexity and the depths of your own self. Your own self and the meaning of the work, and let then the chips fall where they may. But you have to know that in your life and in your work that you stand for something, right? That you stand for something, right? And to the extent that your fellow man, your fellow human being doesn't, then that's on him, right? And eventually he will be pushed aside too. Right? Because I think there is something called progress. We keep moving forward as much as it's the changing same. Right? The changing same, that we have to negotiate many of the same problems that we had to negotiate 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Women are still dealing with what it means to be a woman, right? In a society that's dominated by men, where men hold power in a very particular kind of way. But we push against that, and we stand for something that is more inclusive of that. I really like men. I always have, and I always will, even when they do things that I don't necessarily approve of. But it's up to me to sort of articulate that. And I think that it's sort of up to each and every one of us as we live our lives, right? As we live our lives, there are just certain things that you just would not necessarily say to me to my face. Do you know what I'm saying? Right? And that's important to know, that certain people will simply not say certain things to you. They may act a certain way, but they won't say certain things to you that you represent something, that you hold them accountable in a very particular kind of way. So, y'all, thank you very much. Enjoy the evening, and thanks so much for coming out to be with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you to the museum.